April 12, 1945, somewhere in Bavaria. The shell fragment entered Hans Gartner's left forearm at 4:23 in the afternoon, tearing through muscle with the casual efficiency of hot metal through butter. He didn't scream. 23-year-old SS medics didn't scream. Not when their commanding officer was already shouting at the wounded sprawled across the forest floor. Not when the penalty for weakness was a boot to the ribs or worse. Hans pressed his right hand against the wound and felt warm blood pulse between his fingers, thick and insistent. The pain came later, after the fear. Always after the fear. Around him the forest breathed smoke and cordite. Somewhere beyond the tree line, American artillery continued its methodical conversation with German positions, each explosion punctuating the end of something that had seemed eternal just months before. Hans had stopped believing in eternity 3 days earlier when he'd watched a 19-year-old soldier bleed out from a stomach wound, while their medical supplies consisted of one dirty bandage and half a bottle of schnapps. The boy had died asking for his mother. The officer had called him a coward. Now, crouched behind a shattered oak with blood dripping onto the spring leaves, Hans Gartner understood with sudden clarity that he was more afraid of his own army than of capture. The education of fear, Hans had learned medicine the way most SS medics learned it, hastily, inadequately, under instructors who cared more about ideology than anatomy. The training had been 6 weeks long. 6 weeks to understand the human body's infinite capacity for damage, 0 weeks to understand its capacity for healing. What they taught instead was efficiency, how to bandage quickly under fire, how to prioritize the salvageable from the doomed, how to keep moving when the screaming became unbearable. What they couldn't teach, was how to silence the screaming in your own head. He joined at 20. Convinced by the propaganda and the uniform and the desperate hunger to matter in a world that seemed to be consuming itself. His father had been a pharmacist in Leipzig, a quiet man who believed in precision and cleanliness and the careful measurement of things. Hans had inherited the precision but lost the quietness somewhere between boot camp and the Eastern Front. You couldn't stay quiet when you watched men die from infections that proper antibiotics could have stopped, when you saw gangrene turn flesh black because there was no time for proper amputation, when your commanding officer screamed in your face that you were taking too long to tie a tourniquet on a soldier whose leg was hanging by threads of skin. The SS Medical Corps, Hans had learned, operated on a philosophy of contempt. Contempt for weakness, contempt for hesitation, contempt for the wounded who slowed down the unit's advance. He'd seen medics struck for showing too much compassion, heard officers mock the dying for their tears. Once, near Stalingrad, he'd watched a surgeon operate on a soldier's crushed hand without anesthesia, not because they lacked it, but because the doctor believed pain built character. The soldier had bitten through his own tongue. Hans had held him down and told himself he was helping, that this was necessary, that war demanded hardness. But at night, alone in whatever frozen hole they dug for shelter, he would press his hands against his ears and still hear the screaming. It followed him like a second shadow, that sound. It became the soundtrack of his service, screaming men, shouting officers, the crack of commanders' voices breaking over the broken bodies of soldiers who'd given everything and received nothing but contempt in return. By the spring of 1945, Hans had developed a keen understanding of military priorities. First, maintain the fighting strength. Second, preserve officer morale. Third, conserve resources. The wounded ranked somewhere below equipment maintenance. He'd seen men with treatable wounds left to die because treating them would delay a strategic withdrawal. He'd participated in triage sessions where the most severely injured were simply marked for abandonment. A small chalk mark on the forehead, like grading livestock for slaughter. The logic was simple. They were all going to die anyway. Better to die quickly and save the morphine. The mathematics of suffering. The numbers told their own story. By early 1945, the German military medical system had effectively collapsed. What had once been a sophisticated network of field hospitals, surgical teams, and evacuation protocols had devolved into chaos orchestrated by exhaustion. Hans carried these statistics in his head like prayers to forgotten gods. One medic for every 240 soldiers. One morphine syringe for every 8 wounded men. One clean bandage for every 17 injuries. One chance in 4 that you'd reach a proper hospital if you were hit. One chance in 10 that the hospital would have the supplies to save you. These weren't the numbers they'd taught him in training. Those numbers had been lies. Beautiful lies told by instructors who'd never held a soldier's intestines in their hands while trying to stuff them back inside a torn abdomen. The real mathematics of war were written in blood and screaming and the casual cruelty of men who'd been taught that mercy was weakness. Hans had seen SS officers beat wounded men for crying too loudly, for making sounds that might give away positions. He'd watched superior officers step over dying soldiers without breaking stride, their polished boots carefully avoiding the pools of blood. Once, near Dresden, he'd been ordered to leave a gut-shot private by the roadside because we can't afford the wait. The private had grabbed Hans's ankle as they walked away, his fingers leaving bloody prints on the leather. Hans had kept walking. He was good at following orders. That night he'd vomited until his ribs ached, then reported for duty the next morning with perfect punctuality. The worst part wasn't the death. Death, Hans had learned, was often merciful compared to the alternative. The worst part was the humiliation that preceded it. Wounded men weren't treated as casualties, they were treated as failures. Failures of courage, failures of strength, failures of will. Every wound became evidence of inadequacy, every cry of pain an admission of weakness. The SS medical philosophy could be summarized in 3 words, shouted by 3,000 officers. Stop being weak. Hans had internalized this lesson so thoroughly that when the shell fragment tore through his own arm, his first thought wasn't about the injury itself, but about how much it would slow him down, how much contempt it would earn him, how quickly he needed to hide the evidence of his own inadequacy. His second thought was darker. Capture by the Americans meant death, surely. Death or worse. Revenge for every atrocity the SS had committed. Retribution delivered with the same casual cruelty his own commanders had perfected. Hans had heard the stories. Allied soldiers who executed SS prisoners on sight, who withheld medical care from German wounded, who subjected captured medics to the same brutality they'd inflicted on others. These stories made perfect sense. They fit his understanding of how war worked, how humans worked, how power operated when unleashed from civilian constraints. You did unto others what they would surely do unto you, only faster and with less hesitation. Mercy was a luxury reserved for peacetime, and peacetime was a myth told to children. The moment of surrender. The American patrol found him an hour after sunset, when the spring darkness had turned the forest into a maze of shadows and fear. Hans had tried to run. The wound in his arm had made him clumsy, and exhaustion had made him careless. He'd stumbled over a root, fallen hard, and lay there listening to the sounds of boots approaching through underbrush. This was the end, then. 23 years old, bleeding in a German forest, about to face whatever justice the Americans had devised for SS medics. Hans thought about his father, about the clean pharmacy in Leipzig with its neat rows of bottles and precise labels. He thought about the soldier with the crushed hand, about the private left bleeding by the roadside, about every act of contempt he'd witnessed and enabled. He thought about how much he deserved whatever came next. Don't move. The English was accented but clear. A flashlight beam found his face, held steady. Hans closed his eyes against the glare and waited for the gunshot. Instead, he heard something unexpected, concern. He's wounded. Get the medic. The words didn't make sense. Medic. For him. Or a... Hans opened his eyes and saw American soldiers, 3 of them, weapons lowered but ready. They weren't shooting. They weren't even shouting. One was already unscrewing his canteen, kneeling beside Hans with the careful movements of someone trying not to frighten a wounded animal. Water, the soldier asked, offering the canteen. Hans stared at it. This was a trick. It had to be a trick. Any moment now, the beating would start, the interrogation, the payback for Malmedy and Orador, and 1,000 other names he tried not to remember. But the soldier just kept holding out the canteen, patient, waiting. Danke, Hans whispered and drank. The water was cold and clean. It tasted like nothing he'd drunk in months, months of brackish streams and melted snow, and the metallic tang of emergency rations. It tasted like something from before the war, from a world where people offered water to strangers without calculation or contempt. Let me see that arm. A different soldier, older, with a Red Cross armband, an American medic. Hans's mind struggled to process this development. Why would they waste a medic on an SS prisoner? Why would they waste anything on him at all? The medic was already examining the wound, fingers gentle but efficient, peeling back the crude bandage Hans had fashioned from his own shirt. Shrapnel wound. Fairly clean entry, no major arterial damage. You're lucky. The medic looked up, met Hans's eyes. We'll get you fixed up. Fixed up. As if Hans were something worth repairing. As if his existence had value beyond tactical intelligence. The medic worked quickly, applying antiseptic that stung less than Hans expected, wrapping the wound in clean white gauze that seemed impossibly white against the darkness. No shouting, no hitting, no comments about Hans's SS insignia, or his nationality, or his role in a war that had killed these men's comrades. Just bandaging. Just care. Hans felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built from cynicism and fear, and learned cruelty. He didn't have a word for what he was feeling. The sensation was too unfamiliar, too dangerous to name. It felt like drowning, but in warmth instead of water. "Can you walk?" the medic asked. Hans nodded. He could walk. He could do whatever they wanted. He was their prisoner now, which meant he was powerless, which meant he should be terrified. But terror wasn't what he felt as they helped him to his feet, steadying him when he swayed. What he felt was closer to confusion, the deep, disorienting confusion of discovering that everything you believed about the world might be wrong. The hospital behind the wire. The prisoner of war camp hospital existed in a different universe from any medical facility Hans had known. He understood this within seconds of being led through its entrance, understood it with the visceral certainty of someone whose reality was being systematically dismantled. The first impossibility, cleanliness. Not merely clean, but pristine, the floors scrubbed to a shine that reflected the overhead lights, the walls painted white instead of the gray-brown of German field hospitals. The smell was wrong too, antiseptic and soap instead of gangrene and desperation. Hans had learned to navigate by smell during his service, using odor as a diagnostic tool. The sweet rot of infection, the copper tang of arterial bleeding, the ammonia sharpness of gangrenous tissue. Here, there was only the astringent scent of disinfectant, almost overwhelming in its alien purity. The second impossibility. Quiet. German military hospitals sounded like abattoirs, screaming men, shouting doctors, the clang of metal instruments dropped in haste. Hans had learned to work through noise, had developed the ability to focus on a wound while men shrieked 3 meters away. Here there were voices, certainly, but muted calm, the tones people used in libraries or churches. Patients spoke in normal volumes. Staff moved without urgency. Somewhere, someone was humming. Humming. In a hospital. "Have a seat here." A nurse, American female middle-aged, gestured to a chair beside an examination table. Hans sat, feeling unmoored. The nurse was smiling at him. Actually smiling, not the thin-lipped grimace of exhausted medical staff, but something that looked almost genuine. She began unwrapping his field bandage, and Hans flinched involuntarily, prepared for the rough handling he'd come to expect. Her hands paused. "Did that hurt?" "I'm sorry, I'll be more gentle." Apology. From a nurse to a prisoner. Hans's comprehension kept stuttering, unable to integrate this data with his existing models of how humans behaved under wartime conditions. Why would she apologize? He was SS. He was German. He was the enemy who'd spent years killing men just like the doctors and nurses now treating him. He deserved roughness, deserved contempt, deserved every bit of casual cruelty they might devise. Instead, he received careful attention. The examination was thorough, more thorough than any he'd undergone in German military care. A doctor arrived, young with steady hands and a methodical approach that reminded Hans painfully of his father. The doctor asked questions in fractured German, his accent terrible, but his intent clear. When was he wounded? How much blood had he lost? Was he experiencing any numbness? Any signs of infection? Medical questions, not interrogation, not politics, just the practical concerns of a professional trying to assess a patient's condition. "We'll need to clean this properly, maybe a few stitches," the doctor said. "The good news is you'll keep the arm. Might be a little stiff, but you'll heal fine." You'll heal fine. Not, you might survive if we have time, or we'll see if resources permit treatment, but a simple, confident statement of expected recovery. Hans heard himself make a sound, half laugh, half sob, that drew concerned looks from both doctor and nurse. "Are you in pain?" the nurse asked, already reaching for something. "We can give you something for that." Pain medication for a prisoner. Hans shook his head, not because he wasn't in pain, but because he couldn't process the offer. In his experience, pain medication was reserved for officers or cases of extreme strategic importance. Common soldiers endured. SS soldiers endured more because suffering built character, because weakness was contagious, because sympathy was a luxury they couldn't afford. "I'm okay," he managed in English. "You don't have to be tough here," the doctor said, and began preparing the injection. "Nobody's judging you." Nobody's judging you. Hans wanted to laugh again, wanted to explain that judgment was the only constant in his military experience, that every action was evaluated for signs of weakness or deviance or insufficient commitment. But the doctor was already administering local anesthetic, and the nurse was arranging instruments on a sterile tray, and Hans was beginning to understand that perhaps they really didn't care about his ideological purity or military bearing or capacity for stoic suffering. They cared about the wound. The architecture of dignity. The operation took 47 minutes, Hans counted, partly from professional habit, partly from disbelief. 47 minutes of careful work on a single prisoner's non-life-threatening injury. He'd seen German field surgeons perform 3 amputations in that time, working with assembly line efficiency, while wounded men waited in lines that stretched across muddy fields. Here, there were no lines. Or rather, there were lines, but they moved. Hans could see other prisoners on other examination tables, other doctors providing the same meticulous care. An SS officer, recognizable by his insignia despite the prison uniform, was receiving a blood transfusion 3 beds away. Blood for an SS officer. Precious blood donated by American soldiers, flowing into the veins of a man who'd likely killed Americans. The logic defied comprehension. The doctor worked with quiet competence, irrigating the wound channel, removing fragments of shrapnel too small for field extraction, closing tissue in layers. He explained each step in simple German, his tone conversational, almost pedagogical. "This is the muscle layer. We want good alignment for optimal healing. These sutures are absorbable. You won't need them removed. The skin closure will be subcuticular for minimal scarring." Minimal scarring, as if Hans's future appearance mattered, as if he had a future that included concerns about cosmetic outcomes. The nurse assisted with practiced efficiency, anticipating the doctor's needs without verbal cues. Hans watched their coordination with professional admiration. This was how medical teams were supposed to function, smooth as choreography, no wasted motion or words. Between their collaboration and his observations, he counted 17 separate instruments, each sterilized, each used for its specific purpose, and then set aside. No reusing scalpels without sterilization. No improvising with whatever tools happened to be available. Everything was purpose-built, properly maintained, treated with the respect that medical instruments deserved. His father would have approved. "Almost done," the doctor said, tying off the final suture. "We'll keep you overnight for observation. Make sure there's no infection developing. Nurse Mitchell will get you situated." Overnight observation. In German field hospitals, that phrase meant sleeping on the floor if you're lucky, on the cold ground if you're not. Here, Nurse Mitchell led him to an actual bed, a real bed with sheets and a pillow raised off the ground, positioned near a window that showed the spring twilight settling over the camp. The mattress felt impossibly soft after months of sleeping on frozen earth and splintered floorboards. "Hungry?" she asked. Hans nodded, unable to form words. Nurse Mitchell returned minutes later with a tray, soup, bread, what looked like meat, and a cup of something hot that turned out to be real coffee. Not ersatz, not made from acorns or chicory, but actual coffee with actual cream. Hans held the cup in both hands, feeling its warmth, smelling the aroma that belonged to peacetime and normal life, and mornings when people woke up without screaming. He couldn't remember the last time he'd held something warm without it being a fellow soldier bleeding out in his arms. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in ways that transcended the coffee. Nurse Mitchell patted his shoulder, gently, kindly, the way you'd touch someone who mattered, and moved to her next patient. Hans watched her go, then looked around the ward with new eyes. Everywhere he looked, he saw the same pattern: American medical staff treating German prisoners with careful professionalism, no insults, no rough handling, no casual cruelty masquerading as efficiency, just care. The man in the next bed caught his attention, another German, younger, with bandages covering most of his torso, burns probably, the kind of wounds that German military doctrine classified as resource-intensive and therefore low priority. The young soldier was sleeping, his breathing steady and even, his face relaxed in a way that suggested adequate pain management. Hans ate his soup slowly, tasting each spoonful. It was warm. It was seasoned. It was served in a clean bowl with a clean spoon, and nobody had yelled at him for taking too long to eat it. These facts seemed more miraculous than the medical care itself, more transformative than the stitches in his arm. Somewhere in the basic dignity of a warm meal, Hans Gartner's understanding of humanity began to shift. The night of reckoning darkness came to the hospital ward with electric lights that stayed on, providing illumination soft enough for sleep, but bright enough for medical staff to check on patients throughout the night. Hans lay in his bed, arm bandaged and elevated on a pillow, and tried to reconcile reality with expectation. He had expected interrogation. Instead, medical questions. He had expected brutality. Instead, gentleness. He had expected contempt. Instead, professionalism. He had expected revenge. Instead, care. The cognitive dissonance felt physical, like pressure building behind his sternum. Hans had spent 3 years constructing a worldview that explained the cruelty he'd witnessed and perpetuated. War was brutal, therefore brutality was necessary. The enemy was inhuman, therefore inhumanity was justified, might made right, therefore the powerful earned their cruelty, and the weak deserved their suffering. Every premise of that worldview was being systematically dismantled by clean bandages and warm soup. Around midnight, a night nurse made her rounds, checking vitals, adjusting blankets, asking quiet questions about pain levels. She stopped at each bed, spending the same amount of time with each patient, regardless of nationality or rank or military affiliation. When she reached Hans, she smiled, that same genuine smile that seemed to be standard issue among American medical staff, and asked if he needed anything for comfort. "Why?" Hans asked. The word escaped before he could stop it, emerging in German, raw and confused. The nurse's smile didn't falter. "Why what, honey?" "Why are you?" Hans struggled for English, for concepts he barely understood. "Why do you care? I am SS. I am enemy." She considered this, her expression thoughtful rather than offended. "Well," she said finally, "because you're hurt. And I'm a nurse. That's pretty much all that matters in here." The simplicity of it staggered him. No ideology, no politics, no complex calculations of worthiness or strategic value. Just, you're hurt? I'm a nurse. Therefore, I care. As if human suffering demanded response regardless of the sufferer's history or affiliation. As if compassion didn't require justification beyond the immediate need for it. My son's over there, she continued, gesturing vaguely eastward, fighting somewhere in Germany. I pray every day that if he gets hurt, someone will take care of him. Doesn't matter who, German, American, whoever has the medical training. I just want someone to take care of him. She adjusted Hans's blanket, tucking it around his shoulders. I figure the best thing I can do is take care of whoever comes through here. Make the world a little less cruel, you know. She moved to the next bed, leaving Hans staring at the ceiling with tears streaming down his face. He cried silently, the way soldiers learn to cry, without sound, without movement, only the wet tracks on his cheeks betraying the emotional collapse happening inside. He cried for the soldier with the crushed hand, for the private left by the roadside, for every patient he'd failed because he'd believed cruelty was necessary. He cried for his own lost years, for the ideology that had poisoned his compassion, for the casual brutality he'd accepted as normal. Most of all, he cried because a middle-aged American nurse with a son in combat had just taught him more about humanity than 3 years of military service. The community of the wounded morning brought sunshine through the hospital windows and the smell of real breakfast. Eggs, the nurse told him, and actual ham. Hans sat up carefully, mindful of his bandaged arm, and observed the ward with new attention. Approximately 30 beds, he counted, arranged in neat rows. 23 currently occupied by German prisoners of varying ranks and injuries. 5 American orderlies and 3 nurses visible, moving between beds with practiced efficiency. The mathematics of it troubled him. This level of care for enemy prisoners represented a massive resource allocation. Staff time, medical supplies, food, space. In German military logic, those resources should flow to combat troops, not captured enemies. Yet here they were, being spent freely on men who'd recently been trying to kill the very people now treating them. The strategic irrationality of it verged on the absurd. "Morning," said the burn patient in the next bed. He'd woken while Hans was thinking, young, maybe 20, with intelligent eyes above his bandages. First night in American care. "Yes," Hans replied in German. "You." "3rd week. They pulled me from a burning tank near Stuttgart." The young man's voice carried matter-of-fact acceptance. 90% certain I was dead. Then they dragged me out, got me here, spent 7 hours in surgery removing shrapnel and grafting skin. 7 hours. On me. A Panzer crewman they'd just beaten in battle. "It doesn't make sense," Hans said. "No," the young man agreed. "It doesn't. Not by our standards, anyway. But I think that's the point. Their standards are different." He gestured around the ward with his less bandaged arm. "Look at this place. Really look. What do you see?" Hans looked. He saw orderlies helping patients walk to the latrine, supporting their weight without complaint. He saw nurses changing dressings with careful attention, explaining each step in fractured German. He saw a doctor examining an infected wound on an SS major, the rank insignia still visible on his prison uniform, with the same meticulous concern he'd shown Hans. No hierarchy, Hans realized aloud. Everyone gets the same care. Exactly. Officer or enlisted, SS or Wehrmacht, severely wounded or barely scratched, they treat everyone like they matter equally. The young man shook his head slowly. "In our hospitals, rank determined treatment order. The more important you were, the faster you got care. Here." He laughed, a sound with edges of bitterness and wonder. "Here they go by medical need. Just medical need. The most injured get treated first, regardless of who they are." The concept felt revolutionary. Hans thought about all the times he'd watched officers receive immediate treatment while enlisted men bled out waiting. He'd accepted it as natural, the proper order of things. Valuable personnel deserved priority. Rank reflected worth. The system made sense within the logic of military hierarchy. Except it didn't, did it? Not when you compared it to this system, where worth was assigned universally, and treatment reflected need rather than status. Not when you watched American nurses spend the same amount of time with every patient, giving each the dignity of full attention. The food's insane too, the burn patient continued. 3 meals a day, every day, more calories than we got in combat. And if you're recovering from surgery, they give you extra protein. Extra. Like they want us to heal completely, not just survive barely. Hans had noticed. Breakfast arrived on trays carried by orderlies who wished them good morning in cheerful English. The eggs were real, the ham was thick sliced, and there was bread. White bread, not the sawdust and ersatz mixture they'd been eating for months. Hans ate slowly, savoring each bite, still half convinced this abundance was temporary or illusory. An orderly paused at his bed. "How's the arm feeling today?" "Good," Hans managed in English. "Thank you." "Doctor wants to check it this afternoon, make sure everything's healing right. You need anything before then." The casual attentiveness kept disorienting him. In German military hospitals, you waited until staff had time to notice you needed something. You didn't complain. You certainly didn't expect anyone to ask proactively about your needs. Yet here was an orderly, busy with 30 patients, stopping to check if one German prisoner required anything. "I am fine," Hans said. "Thank you." The orderly nodded and moved on. Hans watched him stop at the next bed, the burn patient's bed, asking the same question with the same genuine concern. There was no performance in it, no pretense. The man simply cared whether his patients were comfortable. "It's going to mess you up," the burn patient said quietly, "being treated like this. You'll go back out there eventually, back to whatever Germany becomes after all this, and you'll remember. You'll remember that the enemy treated you better than your own side ever did." Hans didn't argue. He couldn't. The truth of it was already worming into his consciousness, rearranging everything he thought he understood about loyalty and nation and the proper ordering of human worth. The afternoon revelation. Dr. Morrison arrived at 2:15, accompanied by the same nurse from Hans's initial treatment. The doctor reviewed Hans's chart, an actual medical chart with handwritten notes about his condition, treatment, and progress, before examining the wound with gentle, practiced hands. "Healing beautifully," he announced, satisfaction clear in his voice. "No signs of infection, good tissue response, nice color to the surrounding skin. You're doing great. You're doing great." As if Hans had accomplished something beyond simply allowing his body to repair itself. The encouragement felt foreign, unearned. Hans had been trained to accept criticism and endure correction. Praise for basic biological functions didn't compute. "I want to keep you another couple days for observation," Dr. Morrison continued. "Then we'll move you to the general population camp. But medically, you're past the critical period. That arm's going to be fine. Might have some reduced range of motion, but you'll retain full functionality for daily activities." Full functionality for daily activities. The implication staggered Hans. This American doctor was planning for Hans's future, a future that included daily activities, normal life, a world beyond combat and captivity. Not just ensuring bare survival, but optimizing long-term outcomes, preserving function for a life Hans hadn't imagined he'd live. "Doctor," Hans heard himself ask, "why do you care? About long-term, about function? I am prisoner. I go to camp, maybe eventually back to Germany. Why does it matter if my arm works perfectly?" Dr. Morrison regarded him with an expression Hans couldn't quite decode. Not pity, not condescension, something closer to gentle puzzlement that the question needed asking at all. "Because you're going to live with that arm for hopefully another 50 or 60 years, the doctor said simply. "My job is to make sure those years aren't spent compensating for an injury that didn't heal right. Whether you're in a prison camp or back in Germany or wherever life takes you, you deserve an arm that works." He paused, then added, "Everyone deserves competent medical care, Mr. Gartner. It's not contingent on politics." Not contingent on politics. Hans absorbed this with difficulty. Everything in his military experience had been contingent on politics: who you were, who you knew, which ideological boxes you checked. Care was earned through loyalty, respect through rank, dignity through conformity to the system's demands. The notion that medical treatment might exist outside this framework, might be offered simply because humans required healing, contradicted 3 years of lived experience. In German hospital, Hans said slowly, testing his English and his courage, we have different ways. Officers first, then soldiers by importance, then everyone else if supplies remain. And talking back to commanders. He gestured at his arm. Rough treatment, very rough. Pain is teacher, they say, makes you stronger. Dr. Morrison's expression hardened slightly, not with anger at Hans, but with something that looked like anger on Hans's behalf. Pain doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you hurt. He secured Hans's fresh bandage with careful precision. Proper anesthesia, clean technique, respectful treatment, those make you stronger by giving your body the best chance to heal. Cruelty doesn't teach anything except fear. The nurse, Mitchell, Hans remembered, nodded agreement. My husband's a doctor back home, runs a clinic in Ohio. He always says the first rule of medicine is do no harm. Not do no harm to Americans, or do no harm to people we like. Just do no harm. Period. If you're doing harm, you're not practicing medicine. You're just inflicting injury with medical knowledge. Hans thought about the surgeon near Stalingrad, about operations performed without anesthesia to build character. By Nurse Mitchell's definition, that hadn't been medicine at all. It had been sanctioned torture disguised as treatment, cruelty rationalized through wartime necessity, and ideological conviction. How many patients had Hans himself harmed while believing he was helping? How many times had he prioritized speed over compassion, efficiency over dignity, obedience over patient welfare? The questions opened like wounds in his mind, bleeding guilt and recognition. I have done bad things, he said quietly. As medic, I mean. Not war crimes, but not good medicine, following orders, being fast instead of careful, letting commanders decide who gets care. I thought it was necessary. Dr. Morrison and Nurse Mitchell exchanged a look Hans couldn't interpret. Then the doctor pulled up a stool and sat, positioning himself at Hans's eye level rather than towering over the bed. War makes people do things they wouldn't normally do, Morrison said carefully. Makes them compromise principles they didn't know they could compromise. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. The question is what you do after, whether you learn from it or repeat it. Learn what? Hans asked. That there's always another way. That necessity is usually just an excuse for taking shortcuts we know are wrong. That following orders stops being a defense the moment you understand the orders are creating harm. Morrison tapped Hans's chart gently. You're young. You've got your whole life to practice medicine the right way. Don't waste it convincing yourself the wrong way was ever acceptable. The words hit Hans like a physical force, rearranging his internal architecture. He'd spent 3 years learning to suppress doubt, to silence the voice that questioned orders, to accept cruelty as operational necessity. Now here was an enemy doctor, a man Hans had been taught to view as inferior, as morally corrupted by democracy and weakness, explaining with perfect clarity the path toward redemption Hans hadn't known he needed. Thank you. Hans managed, and the words encompassed far more than medical treatment. The circle of healing. The next 2 days passed in a rhythm Hans had never experienced in military life, ordered but not regimented, structured but not rigid, purposeful but not frantic. The hospital operated with quiet efficiency, its routines designed around patient recovery rather than military necessity. Morning rounds at 7, breakfast at 7:30, first wound check at 9, physical therapy at 11 for those requiring it, lunch at noon, afternoon examinations beginning at 2, dinner at 5, evening medication at 7. Lights dimmed at 9, though not extinguished completely. Between these fixed points, patients had leisure, actual leisure time that belonged to them rather than to the Army's demands. Hans watched men read books provided by the Red Cross, write letters home on paper supplied by American staff, play cards with makeshift decks fashioned from cardboard. The burn patient taught him a complicated German game involving bluffing and memory. An Austrian corporal with a leg wound sketched portraits of other patients, capturing their faces with surprising skill. It felt like being human again, like being something more than a uniform and a function. On his second full day, Hans witnessed something that crystallized his transformation. An SS officer, Sturmbannführer rank, recognizable despite prison clothing, developed complications from a chest wound. Infection spreading, fever climbing, the kind of situation German military medicine would have resolved with quick triage, too resource-intensive to save, mark him for morphine and let him drift off. Instead, Dr. Morrison assembled a team. Hans watched through the night as American medical staff fought for 8 hours to save a man who'd likely commanded atrocities, who represented everything the Allies were fighting against. They used antibiotics Hans had never heard of, performed procedures he couldn't follow, rotated staff to maintain peak performance. The surgeon, a colonel Hans learned, outranking the SS officer he was treating, worked with absolute concentration, treating the infected tissue with painstaking care. At 4 in the morning, the officer's fever broke. At 6, he was breathing easier. At 8, Dr. Morrison declared him stable and went off shift, looking exhausted but satisfied. Hans cornered the doctor before he could leave. "Why?" he asked, abandoning grammar for urgency. "That man, he is SS officer, high rank, probably did terrible things. Why work so hard to save him?" Morrison regarded him with tired eyes. "Because that's what doctors do, Hans. We treat patients, not uniforms, not ranks, not political affiliations. Patients. That man in there." He gestured toward the recovering officer. "Right now, he's not an SS officer. He's a patient with an infection threatening his life. My job is to fight that infection, not to judge his past." "But what if he goes back, does more terrible things?" "Not my department," Morrison said firmly. "Military courts can judge his war record. Prison camps can hold him accountable. But in my hospital, he's just another patient who needs healing. The moment I start deciding who deserves care based on their moral worth, I stop being a doctor and become something else, something worse." The principle seemed simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. Hans had spent 3 years in a system where moral worth determined everything, where ideology shaped medical decisions, where humanity was conditional and contingent. The alternative, treating everyone equally regardless of who they were or what they'd done, felt almost dangerously simple. "What about revenge?" Hans pressed. "Don't you want revenge for what we did?" "Every day," Morrison admitted quietly. "I lost friends at Normandy, at the Bulge, in a dozen places I can't pronounce. Every time I treat a German prisoner, part of me remembers that some German soldier might have killed one of my friends. But that's not who I am in here. In here, I'm a doctor. Revenge is what happens when we forget that medicine transcends war." He clapped Hans gently on the shoulder, the gesture now familiar, comforting rather than startling, and headed for his quarters. Hans returned to his bed and lay awake until morning, thinking about transcendence and revenge, and the radical idea that humanity didn't need to be earned. The testament of change. On his 3rd day, Hans was declared fit for transfer to the general prisoner population. His arm had healed cleanly, the stitches were dissolving properly, and continued hospitalization was medically unnecessary. A part of Hans mourned this progress, knowing what he was leaving. This strange sanctuary, where enemies became patients and cruelty was replaced by care. Before he left, Nurse Mitchell gave him written instructions for wound care, complete with diagrams. "Keep it clean," she said. "Don't do heavy lifting for another 2 weeks. If you notice any redness, swelling, or drainage, tell the camp medical staff immediately." She was planning for his welfare beyond the hospital walls, assuming he'd have access to continuing care, assuming he'd matter enough for someone to check on his healing. These assumptions contradicted everything Hans had internalized about captivity, yet Nurse Mitchell delivered them with casual confidence. as if compassionate follow-up care for prisoners was obvious and natural. "Thank you," Hans said, and meant it comprehensively. "For everything. For arm, for food, for being kind. I will not forget." "You take care of yourself, honey," she replied, squeezing his hand. "And if you ever become a doctor yourself, remember what you learned here." The words planted themselves in Hans's mind like seeds. Dr. Morrison appeared for a final check, examined the wound one last time, and pronounced himself satisfied. "You'll have a scar," he said, "but it should be fairly minimal. The arm should regain full range of motion within 2 months." He extended his hand for a shake, a gesture of equality, of respect between professionals. "Stay healthy, Hans." Hans shook his hand, feeling the calluses of a surgeon's grip, the warmth of human connection that transcended categories of friend and enemy. "Dr. Morrison," he said carefully, "when war is over, when I go back to Germany, I want to be doctor. Real doctor, like you, is possible." Morrison smiled, the first truly broad smile Hans had seen from him. "Of course it's possible. You've got the temperament for it, and you've seen enough suffering to understand why it matters. Study hard. Stay honest with yourself about what you learned here, and you'll make a fine doctor." "Even though I was SS." "Even though," Morrison confirmed. "What you were doesn't define what you can become. That's up to you. The world beyond the wire. The general prisoner population camp existed in the same universe as the hospital, but operated on different principles. Here, men lived in barracks instead of hospital beds, worked details instead of recovering from wounds, and navigated the complex social dynamics of captured soldiers trying to maintain dignity in defeat." Hans adjusted quickly, his medical skills making him valuable to both prisoners and guards. He tended minor injuries, advised on hygiene, helped establish a makeshift infirmary for the kind of everyday ailments that didn't warrant hospital transfer. The camp commander, an American captain with pragmatic instincts, granted him relative freedom to practice basic medicine, recognizing that keeping prisoners healthy reduced problems for everyone. But Hans's real work happened at night, in quiet conversations with fellow prisoners still processing their shock at American treatment. Many, like Hans, had been taught that capture meant death or torture. Finding themselves adequately fed, properly housed, and generally unmolested confused them. Some adapted quickly. Others clung to ideology, insisting this treatment proved American weakness rather than strength. Hans argued against them with newfound conviction. "I was shot," he'd tell doubters. "Bleeding, afraid, certain I was dead. They gave me water, treated my wound, fed me, put me in a real bed, spent hours making sure my arm would heal properly. Not just survive, but heal correctly so I could use it normally for the rest of my life." He'd gesture around the barracks. "Look at this place. We have shelter, food, medical care, male privileges, recreation time. How is this weakness? This is strength. The strength to treat enemies like humans even when you don't have to." "It's propaganda," an older prisoner insisted during one such debate. "They want us soft, compliant. Back home, our treatment of prisoners was necessary. War demands hard men." "Hard men," Hans repeated slowly. "Is that what we were? Or were we just cruel?" "I've seen both systems now. I know which one I want to preserve when I get home." "You sound like them," another prisoner sneered, "like you've been converted." "Maybe I have," Hans admitted. "Maybe being treated with basic human dignity converted me from believing cruelty was necessary. If that's conversion, I'll take it over what we had." These conversations earned him some enemies among the more ideologically committed prisoners, but they also attracted others, men who'd experienced similar moments of recognition, who were quietly reconstructing their understanding of humanity and power and the proper way to treat other humans. They formed an informal group, meeting to discuss what they'd learned, what they wanted to preserve, how they might return to Germany carrying seeds of this different approach. One man, a former Wehrmacht surgeon, became particularly close to Hans. Dr. Friedrich Weber had spent 2 years on the Eastern Front, had seen horrors that made Hans's experiences seem gentle. His capture had been his salvation, he said freely. Salvation from becoming completely brutalized, from losing the last remnants of his medical ethics. I was forgetting why I became a doctor, Weber confessed one evening. Forgetting that the point was to heal, not to serve political ends. Here, I remembered. These Americans, they showed me what I'd lost without even realizing I'd lost it. What will you do after? Hans asked. When we go back. Rebuild German medicine, Weber said with quiet certainty. Not the ideology-soaked version we had, but something better. Medicine that serves patients, not politics. Medicine that treats everyone equally, regardless of who they are. He looked at Hans. You should join me. Young doctors like you, who've seen both systems, who understand what we need to change. Germany will need people like you. The invitation felt like a calling, like the universe aligning around a purpose Hans hadn't known he was seeking. Yes, he said simply. Yes, I'll join you. The Journal of Transformation. Hans began keeping a journal, writing in cramped script on whatever paper he could obtain. The entries documented his transformation, his attempts to capture in words the radical shift in his understanding of human worth and medical ethics. May 15, 1945. Today I helped set a broken finger for a young prisoner who broke it during work detail. Simple procedure, nothing complex. But I realized I was doing it differently than I would have 3 months ago. Asking about his pain, explaining what I was doing, making sure he was comfortable before I manipulated the bone. These seem like small things, but they're everything. They're the difference between seeing a patient and seeing a problem to solve. Dr. Morrison would be proud. May 22. Argument today with Hans K. about American weakness in treating prisoners well. He insists strength means domination, that our defeat proves we were too soft. I told him our defeat proves nothing about moral philosophy, just about material resources and strategic mistakes. But his words bother me. How many Germans think like him? How do you rebuild a nation's ethics when so many believe cruelty was justified? June 3rd. Letter from Mother arrived. She thinks I'm dead. The Red Cross hasn't updated our status yet. I've written back, tried to explain where I am, what I've learned. How do I tell her that captivity saved me? That the Americans showed me what humanity looks like? She'll think I've been brainwashed? Maybe I have. If so, I never want to be unwashed again. June 18th. Dr. Weber and I are planning. After repatriation, we'll push for medical education reform, emphasize medical ethics, patient-centered care, the principles we've seen here. It sounds ambitious, maybe impossible. Germany will be ruins, occupied, broken. But that's exactly when we can rebuild foundations. People will be looking for new ways to think about things. We have to be ready, with answers. July 4th. The Americans are celebrating their Independence Day. They shared extra food with us. Cake, real cake. And explained what they were celebrating. Freedom, they said. Self-determination. The right to choose their own government. I thought about how we were taught that freedom was weakness, that strong nations needed strong leaders to tell people what to think. Eating that cake, watching Americans celebrate choice and liberty, I understood something. Maybe the reason we lost wasn't material at all. Maybe nations that respect human dignity have access to resources nations built on contempt can never tap. The voluntary loyalty of people who feel valued, not dominated. The journal grew, page by page, becoming a testament to transformation. Hans recorded conversations with American staff, observations about camp administration, reflections on his previous beliefs, and their systematic dismantling. He noted small kindnesses and large ethical principles, building an archive of evidence that humanity could survive even the inhuman conditions of war. In September, he wrote an entry that would later become famous. September 7th, 1945. The war in Europe has been over for months now. We're still prisoners, still waiting for repatriation, still living behind wire. But I realize I'm not really a prisoner anymore, at least not in the way I expected to be. My body is confined, but my mind has been freed. freed from ideology that taught me to see humans as categories, freed from belief that cruelty was necessary, freed from the conviction that strength required dominance. For the first time in my life, I understand what my father tried to teach me with his careful pharmacy, his precise measurements, his insistence on doing things right, that true strength is in care, not force, in healing, not harming, in seeing each person as worthy of your best effort, regardless of who they are or what they've done. The Americans defeated us militarily, but more importantly, they defeated us morally, by showing that you can be strong without being cruel, disciplined without being inhuman, victorious without losing your humanity. That's the lesson I'm taking home. That's what I'm going to teach. The return repatriation came in late November when the first snows were dusting the German landscape Hans hadn't seen since spring. The train carrying released prisoners rolled through bombed cities and ruined countryside, through the physical evidence of Germany's defeat. Hans pressed his face against the window and saw devastation, but also possibility. Ruins could be rebuilt. Nations could be remade. People could learn new ways of being. His arm, fully healed now, bore a thin scar where American medicine had saved not just his flesh, but his future. Hans touched it sometimes, a reminder of transformation, of the moment when enemy became healer and cruelty gave way to care. He returned to Leipzig and found his father's pharmacy, damaged but standing. His father, miraculously, had survived. They stood in the ruins of the shop, and Hans told his story, all of it. The wound and the capture and the hospital and the revelation that humanity didn't require ideology to justify itself. His father wept. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, "not just to war, but to what war makes of people. But you came back." "I came back different," Hans admitted. "Better, I hope, but definitely different." "Better," his father confirmed, gripping his shoulder. "Much better." Hans enrolled in medical school in 1946, using his wartime experience and American recommendation letters to gain admission despite the chaos of post-war Germany. Dr. Weber kept his promise, joining the faculty of a Berlin medical school and pushing relentlessly for curriculum reform. Together they became advocates for a new kind of German medicine, one based on patient dignity, universal care, and the radical proposition that medical ethics transcended politics. It was difficult work. Post-war Germany was a landscape of competing ideologies, occupied zones with different philosophies, a population traumatized and divided. Many resisted change, insisting that German medicine had been fine, that wartime conditions had simply required efficiency, that returning to strict hierarchies would restore order. Hans argued against them with stories. He told rooms full of students about American hospitals that treated enemy prisoners with meticulous care. He described Dr. Morrison's philosophy that medicine transcended war, Nurse Mitchell's simple conviction that hurt people deserved healing. He showed his scar and explained how American professionals had optimized his long-term function when German doctrine would have settled for bare survival. This is what strength looks like, he'd tell skeptical audiences. Not domination, not cruelty, but care so comprehensive that even your enemies receive it. That's the medicine I want Germany to practice. Slowly, painfully, the message spread. The legacy Hans Gartner practiced medicine for 43 years, retiring in 1988 at age 66. He specialized in emergency medicine, drawn to the acute care setting where his wartime experience proved most relevant. He trained 3 generations of German doctors, teaching them not just medical technique but medical philosophy, the ethics he'd learned in an American prison camp hospital. He never forgot Dr. Morrison's principle, treat the patient, not the uniform. It became his professional motto, guiding his interactions with every person who came through his emergency room. Rich or poor, German or foreign, sympathetic or difficult, everyone received the same meticulous care, the same respect, the same assumption of inherent worth. His students loved him. His colleagues respected him. His patients remembered him as the doctor who always took time to explain, to comfort, to see them as humans rather than cases. But Hans's most lasting contribution came through his writing and speaking. Starting in the 1950s, he began publishing articles about medical ethics, about the lessons of wartime medicine, about what German medicine could learn from examining its failures. He spoke at conferences across Europe, telling his story of transformation, arguing that true medical professionalism required treating all patients equally. In 1968, he testified at the medical crimes trials, providing expert witness testimony about the systematic cruelty embedded in German military medicine. It was painful work confronting the reality of what his profession had enabled and participated in. But Hans believed documentation mattered, that Germany needed to face its medical failures as directly as its military ones. "We cannot build better medicine on lies," he told the tribunal. "We must acknowledge what we did, why we did it, and why it was wrong. Only then can we construct something better." His most famous work, published in 1975, was a memoir titled The Scar That Saved Me. It told his story in detail: the wound, the capture, the American hospital, the revelation that humanity didn't require ideology to justify itself. The book became required reading in German medical schools, a testament to the possibility of transformation, even after profound moral failure. Critics called him naive, accused him of American propaganda, insisted that wartime conditions had justified the harsh medicine he criticized. Hans replied with patient consistency, "I've seen both systems. I know which one treated patients like humans, and which one treated them like resources. If that makes me naive, so be it. I'd rather be naive and compassionate than sophisticated and cruel." In 1982, the American Medical Association invited him to speak at their annual conference. Hans accepted, traveling to the United States for the first time since the war. Standing before thousands of American doctors, he told his story once more. Older now, his voice weathered by age and testimony, but his message unchanged. "You defeated us in 1945, he concluded. But the real victory wasn't military, it was moral. It was showing that strength doesn't require cruelty, that discipline doesn't demand brutality, that you can maintain professional standards while treating everyone with dignity. That lesson changed my life. It changed German medicine. It proved that even in war, we can choose humanity over ideology." The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. After his speech, an elderly doctor approached him, hand extended. "I'm Thomas Morrison," the man said. "I treated a young German medic in '45. Shrapnel wound to the arm. Don't suppose you'd remember me." Hans stared, recognition flooding through him like electricity. The face had aged, the hair had whitened, but the eyes remained the same. Calm, competent, kind. "Dr. Morrison," Hans breathed, "you saved my life." "I treated an arm wound," Morrison corrected gently. "You saved your own life by learning from it." They embraced, two old men crying in a conference center ballroom, surrounded by doctors who understood that sometimes medicine's greatest victories have nothing to do with surgical skill and everything to do with remembering that patients are human beings first. The final testament, Hans Gartner, died in 1994, 2 weeks after his 72nd birthday. The cancer had been quick, diagnosed in August, fatal by October. He faced it with the same calm pragmatism he'd brought to his medical practice, accepting treatment when it offered benefit, declining it when it offered only suffering prolonged. His hospital room in Leipzig filled with flowers from former patients, colleagues, students who'd absorbed his teachings and carried them into their own practices. Dr. Weber visited daily, now himself elderly, but still sharp, still fighting for the medical ethics they'd pledged to build together 5 decades earlier. "We did it," Weber said during one visit, holding Hans's hand. "German medicine isn't perfect, but it's better, more humane, more focused on patient dignity. That's because of you." "Because of Dr. Morrison," Hans corrected, his voice weak but certain. "Because of Nurse Mitchell. Because Americans showed us what we'd forgotten. That medicine only works when it serves humanity, not ideology." "You carried that message home," Weber insisted. "You made people listen. That matters, Hans. It matters enormously." In his final days, Hans asked his daughter, herself a doctor, trained in the ethics her father had championed, to read him passages from his old journal, the one he'd kept in the prison camp. She sat beside his bed, and read his younger self's words about transformation and recognition, about cake on the 4th of July and the radical simplicity of treating everyone equally. "Did you ever regret it?" she asked after finishing a particularly emotional entry. "Coming home and fighting so hard to change things. It cost you, Papa. The criticism, the resistance, the people who never forgave you for admitting we were wrong." Hans smiled, the expression costing him effort but worth it. "Never. Not once. I got to spend 43 years practicing real medicine. Medicine that healed without humiliating, that treated everyone with dignity, that saw patients as humans rather than problems. That's worth any amount of criticism." "You changed German medicine," his daughter said, tears streaming down her face. "German medicine changed me first," Hans replied. "It broke me, made me cruel without realizing it, taught me that efficiency mattered more than compassion. The Americans fixed what German medicine broke. I just tried to pass that gift forward." He died on October 23rd, surrounded by family, his scarred arm resting peacefully on clean hospital sheets. The obituaries called him a pioneer of medical ethics, a voice of moral clarity, a bridge between Germany's shameful past and its more humane future. But Hans would have preferred simpler words. A doctor who learned that everyone deserves care and spent his life making sure they received it. Epilogue: The Ripple Effect. The scar on Hans Gartner's arm outlived him by only hours, cremated with his body, returned to atoms, scattered in a Leipzig garden where his father's pharmacy once stood. But the metaphorical scar, the mark left by American care on German consciousness, proved more durable. By 2015, 70 years after Hans's capture, German medical education had been transformed. Every medical student now received extensive ethics training, learned about patient autonomy and dignity, studied the historical failures that Hans had spent his life documenting and opposing. The cruel efficiency of wartime medicine had been replaced by a system that prized compassion alongside competence. Hans's memoir remained required reading. His speeches circulated as teaching tools. His principle, treat the patient, not the uniform, had been absorbed so thoroughly into German medical culture that most young doctors didn't know where it originated, couldn't name the man who'd fought to establish it. That anonymity would have pleased Hans. He'd never sought fame, only transformation. The goal was never to be remembered, but to change how medicine was practiced, to ensure that future patients received the care he'd been shocked to receive in an American prison camp hospital. Dr. Morrison lived to 93, dying peacefully in 2002, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who'd all heard the story of the young German medic whose life he'd changed by simply practicing medicine the way medicine should be practiced. He'd followed Hans's career from afar, read his memoir with tears of pride, corresponded with him occasionally across the decades. In his final interview, given to a medical journal 2 months before his death, Morrison was asked about his most significant professional accomplishment. The interviewer expected him to mention his surgical innovations, his contributions to trauma care, his decorated military service. Instead, Morrison smiled and said, "I helped a young German soldier understand that medicine transcends politics. He took that lesson home and changed an entire nation's approach to medical care. That's what I'm proudest of. Not what I did directly, but what I enabled someone else to do by treating him with basic human decency." Nurse Mitchell had died earlier, in 1987, but not before seeing Hans once more. He'd visited her in Ohio during his 1982 trip to America, brought flowers and gratitude, spent an afternoon drinking coffee and remembering that spring when the war ended and humanity briefly triumphed over ideology. "You were so scared," she'd recalled, laughing gently at the memory. "Terrified we were going to hurt you, convinced you deserved punishment. And all we did was bandage your arm and give you soup. Basic stuff. But you looked at us like we'd performed a miracle." "You did," Hans had insisted. "You performed the miracle of seeing me as human when I'd been taught to see myself as merely German, merely SS, merely enemy. That's the greatest miracle medicine can perform, restoring humanity when it's been systematically stripped away. Now both were gone, Morrison and Mitchell, Gartner and Weber, that entire generation of doctors who'd witnessed medicine's capacity for both cruelty and compassion, who'd lived through the transformation from one to the other. But their legacy persisted in every German doctor who asked about pain before treating it, who explained procedures to patients, who saw healthcare as a human right rather than a privilege earned through proper ideology. The living memory. In 2025, 80 years after Hans Gartner's capture, a young German emergency medicine resident named Anna Hoffmann encountered a refugee patient, Syrian, traumatized by war, bleeding from shrapnel wounds sustained in a bombing 3 years earlier. The wounds had been poorly treated initially, had developed chronic complications, required extensive surgical intervention. Anna treated him with meticulous care. She explained each step of the treatment plan in simple German, waiting for translation. She ensured adequate pain management. She coordinated with social services to arrange follow-up care. She spent 2 hours on a single patient when the emergency room was crowded because this patient needed 2 hours and rushing would compromise outcomes. Her attending physician, observing this interaction, nodded approval. After the patient was admitted for surgery, the attending pulled Anna aside. "You handled that well," he said. Compassionate, thorough, professional. Treated him with dignity despite the language barrier and the complexity of his case. "Isn't that just standard care?" Anna asked, genuinely confused. "It is now," the attending replied. "It wasn't always. You know about Gartner?" Anna nodded. Every German medical student knew about Hans Gartner. His memoir was assigned reading. His principles were embedded in the curriculum. But for Anna's generation, those principles felt self-evident, natural, the only conceivable way to practice medicine. She couldn't imagine an alternative. Gartner wrote that the Americans showed him something revolutionary, the attending continued. But you know what's actually revolutionary? That for your generation, his revelation feels obvious. That you can't conceive of medicine practiced any other way. That's how you know transformation succeeded, when radical change becomes common sense. Anna thought about this later during her break reading Hans Gartner's memoir in the hospital library. She found the passage describing his first night in American care, his confusion at being treated with dignity, his tears at receiving basic compassion. The emotional intensity felt foreign to her, not because she lacked empathy, but because she'd been raised in a medical culture that had absorbed Gartner's lessons so thoroughly that cruelty in healthcare seemed not just wrong, but incomprehensible. That incomprehension was Hans Gartner's true legacy. Not that he'd taught people compassion should exist, but that he'd helped create a system where compassion was so fundamental that its absence became unthinkable. The universal truth. The story of Hans Gartner's transformation isn't unique to Germany or to medicine or to World War II. It's a story that repeats wherever humans construct systems of cruelty and then encounter alternatives, wherever ideology bumps against basic human decency and discovers that decency wins. It's the story of every prisoner of war who discovered their captors were human. Every child soldier who learned that adulthood offered choices beyond violence. Every person raised in hate who encountered someone who refused to hate them back. Every individual convinced that cruelty was necessary who discovered that kindness was possible. These transformations share a common structure, expectation shattered by reality, ideology confronted by experience, learned contempt, dissolved by actual encounter with the humanity of the other. Hans expected revenge and received care. That single dissonance, that one moment when reality contradicted everything he'd been taught, created space for transformation. But transformation required more than one moment. It required sustained exposure to an alternative way of being, repeated demonstrations that the new approach wasn't anomalous or performative, but genuinely different. Hans didn't change because of one bandage or one meal. He changed because every interaction in that American hospital reinforced the same message: humans deserve dignity, period. No qualifications required. This is why Dr. Morrison's principle, treat the patient, not the uniform, proved so powerful. It reduced ethics to absolute simplicity. Patients need healing. Doctors provide healing. Everything else is irrelevant. No complicated calculations of worthiness, no ideological litmus tests, just need and response, suffering and care, the most basic human transaction possible. Hans carried that simplicity home and spent 43 years expanding it, applying it, teaching it to generations of German doctors who would never experience the crisis that had revealed it to him. He became a bridge between systems, a translator who could explain American principles in German context, who could say, "Here's what I learned from enemies who became healers." The bridge worked because Hans never claimed moral superiority. He acknowledged his complicity in cruel medicine, admitted his initial acceptance of brutality as necessary. This honesty gave him credibility with audiences that might have rejected preaching from someone who'd always been righteous. Hans could say, "I was wrong, and here's how I learned better in ways that open minds rather than closing them." The question for every generation. Hans Gartner's story poses an uncomfortable question for every generation. What cruelties do we accept as necessary that future generations will find incomprehensible? For Hans's contemporaries, it was medical treatment based on rank and ideology, care rationed according to political worth, suffering inflicted to build character. These practices seemed justified by wartime necessity, by limited resources, by the belief that hard times required hard people. But necessity proved negotiable. Resources could be allocated differently. Hardness turned out to be weakness disguised as strength, the weakness of people who couldn't imagine treating others with dignity because they'd never experienced dignity themselves. What seemed immutable dissolved when confronted with alternatives. This pattern repeats throughout history. Systems of cruelty persist not because they're necessary, but because they're familiar, because people can't imagine alternatives, because those benefiting from cruelty convince those suffering under it that no other way exists. Then someone encounters an alternative. A prison camp hospital, a foreign culture, a book, a conversation. A moment when reality contradicts ideology so completely that transformation becomes possible. Hans Gartner was one person who had one such moment. But his importance lies not in his uniqueness, but in his representativeness. He stands for everyone who's ever learned that the cruelty they accepted, enabled, or inflicted wasn't necessary after all. He reminds us that transformation is possible, that people can change, that systems can be rebuilt on better foundations. But he also reminds us that transformation requires courage, courage to acknowledge complicity, courage to admit previous beliefs were wrong, courage to advocate for change despite resistance from those who preferred the old ways. Hans faced criticism, skepticism, outright hostility from people who insisted German medicine had been fine, that wartime conditions had justified everything, that returning to strict hierarchies would restore order. He kept arguing anyway, kept telling his story, kept insisting that he'd seen a better way, and Germany could build it too. That persistence, that willingness to be uncomfortable, to challenge his culture, to risk rejection for the sake of change, that's what made transformation collective rather than merely personal. Conclusion: the wound that never healed. The scar on Hans Gartner's arm healed within weeks. The wound to his understanding of humanity, the deep injury inflicted by discovering that everything he'd believed about strength and power and the proper treatment of others was wrong. That wound never fully healed. It wasn't supposed to. Some wounds aren't meant to close, aren't supposed to fade into invisibility. Some wounds need to remain slightly tender, slightly visible, constant reminders of lessons learned through pain. Hans's psychological scar, the permanent mark left by American care on his German consciousness, stayed with him for 48 years, guiding his practice, informing his teaching, shaping his advocacy. He died carrying that scar, that permanent reminder that humans could be better than ideology suggested, that medicine could serve humanity rather than power, that care could transcend politics. And because he refused to let that wound heal over and disappear, because he kept it visible through his writing and speaking and teaching, thousands of other doctors acquired similar scars, secondhand wounds from reading about his transformation, learning from his experience, absorbing his principles. Those secondhand scars changed German medicine. They created a culture where patient dignity became fundamental, where compassion was viewed as professional rather than weak, where treating everyone equally seemed not just ethical, but obvious. Hans Gartner entered American captivity as an SS medic, convinced that cruelty was necessary and care was contingent on worthiness. He emerged as a human being who understood that everyone deserves healing, that dignity doesn't need to be earned, that true strength lies in compassion rather than domination. That transformation, from ideologue to humanist, from someone who accepted cruelty to someone who spent his life fighting it, that's the real story. The shrapnel wound was just the beginning, the physical injury that brought Hans into contact with a system so different from his own that it shattered his understanding of how humans could treat each other. The wound that changed his life wasn't the one in his arm. It was the one in his worldview, torn open by clean bandages and warm soup and nurses who apologized for causing discomfort, and doctors who spent hours saving enemy officers because that's what doctors do. That wound, that beautiful, necessary wound, never closed. And because it didn't, thousands of others learned to see humans the way Hans learned to see them, as patients deserving care, as people worthy of dignity, as individuals whose suffering demands response regardless of who they are or what they've done. 70 years after American medical staff showed a frightened young SS medic that enemies could become healers, German doctors still practice the medicine Hans Gartner spent his life teaching. They still treat patients rather than uniforms. They still believe that everyone deserves care. They still carry, without knowing it, the scar of Hans Gartner's transformation. And in that invisible wound, preserved across generations, lives the simple truth that changed one man's life, and through him, changed a nation's approach to healing. Humanity doesn't require justification. Compassion doesn't need permission. Care is not contingent on ideology. Medicine, practiced correctly, transcends everything but the immediate human need for healing. That's what the Americans taught Hans Gartner in the spring of 1945. That's what Hans Gartner taught Germany for the next 48 years. That's the wound that healed more than flesh. It healed slowly and painfully. The capacity for cruelty that war had normalized and ideology had justified. One arm wound, one hospital stay, one man's transformation, a nation's medical ethics forever changed.